design in Asia. Are you okay? Do you want to record?
Recording.
Okay, yeah. Because I was gonna record your lecture part. Okay, I'll record as well. Okay. So about this event, the reason we started this conversation is the students reached out and saying, oh, there's a at MoMA there is a Chinese architecture exhibition which I went to, and I was a little bit disappointed. It's so small, but I mean some interesting works. So people are saying we should have a field trip. And I was like, okay, I actually know someone who does research in this realm. She's actually Dijia is actually talking about how overseas exhibitions sort of shift architectural discourse in China, and how does that place Chinese architectural discourse in the this world world arena. So that's why we kind of back and forth bouncing off ideas. Then we just end up with this event, which I invited Dijia to come to talk to us about her research and about her sort of reflection on the the exhibitions, overseas exhibitions of young Chinese architects. Well, they're no longer young these days, but Chinese architects. So a little introductory about Dijia. Dijia Chen is a fourth-year doctoral candidate in the Construct Environment program at the University of Virginia, where we knew each other, School of Architecture. Her doctoral dissertation critically examines the architectural production of the developing world as a form of mediated knowledge under asymmetrical power dynamics, bringing together the study of contemporary Chinese architecture, transcultural communication studies, and curatorial studies. She has accepted over 10 fellowships and grants from organizations including the American Society of Learned Society, Society of Studies. Oh, I have someone in the waiting room. American Society of Learned Studies, Society of Architectural Historian, Visual Studies Association, etc. She has co-authored a book, and her paper are published in Architectural History Review, Log, which is a quite prestigious journal, Histories of Post-War Architecture, etc. So without further ado, the floor is yours. Dijia, you can share your knowledge about what you know about MoMA and TUMU. Oh. All right, what is yours?
Great. So just one question: should I be monitoring the waiting room, or is someone monitoring?
Someone else will do that.
Okay.
Yeah. You just focus on what you do.
Okay. I'll just share my screen now. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yes.
So, hi everyone, I'm Dijia Chen, and as Zihao has already said, I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate from the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. Many thanks to Professor Zihao Zhang and Spitzer School of Architecture Asian Club for this invitation. I'm totally thrilled to share my research with you all. I'd especially like to thank Mary Leduc and Tanya Reith for coming to this lecture, because they have greatly supported my research in the past. If you pay attention, you are going to see Mary's book and also Tanya's photo in my slides, actually. So I know many of you are going to see this MoMA's first exhibition on contemporary Chinese architecture. I personally have no chance to see it in person, but the curatorial advice of this exhibition was from my previous supervisor, Professor Xiangning Li from Tongji University. And I have collected opinions from a lot of exhibitors when I did my research trip back in China this summer. Also, an academic journal in China is also asking me to write an exhibition review on this. So everybody seems really thrilled. We may say that this is a huge event for the whole architectural community in China. So I don't know what you guys would think after actually visiting this exhibition, and I guess we can talk about that later. But today our topic is not exactly focused on this exhibition or the practices of this group of architects. Instead, I want to dial time 20 years back and take you through another exhibition, which was held in Berlin at the turn of the century. So this exhibition, TUMU, Young Architecture of China, was the first overseas exhibition on contemporary Chinese architects. Today, I hope to share the history related to this exhibition and answer the following questions. So what criteria were established to evaluate the value of contemporary Chinese architects? What are changed or unchanged after their 20 years of overseas activities? Why are independent architects in place of design institutes representing China on the world platform? And how do we understand cultural identity and localness in a hyper-mediated and connected world today? This lecture will be divided into 3 parts. So the TUMU exhibition and its historical background, the domestic and international impact of TUMU, and how we may look at the MoMA exhibition through the lens of TUMU. So TUMU was a Germany-based exhibition which marked the first foreign attempt to recognize independent Chinese architects in a time when these architects were marginalized and suppressed at home. Since the socialist reforms in the 1950s, the state-owned design institutes have been monitoring all design and construction works in China. These institutes are modeled after the Soviet system and consists of thousands of architects working together and having meals together in a huge dining hall. Under the planned economy, the design institutes produce architectural works that are sufficient, functionalist, and anonymous. All architects are nameless cogs in a giant system, and no individual is credited for the design work. It was a time when individual creativity is seldom allowed in architectural design. After the end of the Cultural Revolution in the mid-1970s, the opening up policy was enacted under Deng Xiaoping's regime. The social reforms and economic boost quickly provoked the emergence of rebellious movements in the cultural and artistic realms in China. Modern artists, writers, and poets formed groups to discuss new possibilities and orientations. Like as you can see in the pictures here, there were lectures and competitions, and a lot of people were very actively engaged in these activities. So personal creativity was also encouraged. The modern art movement was perhaps the most radical one. In 1979, the Star Groups held its first unauthorized exhibition on the railings of Beihai Park. As you can see in the photo here, these paintings were very different from the mainstream ink paintings that were usually exhibited in the mainstream art exhibitions. But like you can see in the picture, a lot of people come to see the exhibition, and it made quite an impact at the time. So this marked the beginning of a new and controversial art movement that developed into the '85 New Wave. It further eradicated the ideologized art traditions with new approaches. The artists at the time experimented with bodily expression, performances, and sought rationality and individualism against the totalitarian ideology at the time. Also, as you can see from these paintings, the Western influence was quite obvious as well. Then in 1989, the movement was further matured as a sensational exhibition in Beijing. It was immediately shut down by the authority after one artist shot a bullet at the mirror. The photo here on the right features Xiao Lu, who moved to the United States soon after the exhibition was shut down. As Gao-Ming Lu observes, in comparison to these realms, architecture is relatively slow to change. However, a curator and art critic, Wang Mingxian, became very interested in architecture during the late 1980s and actively organized forums, salons, and journal issues for the emerging independent architects at the time. Wang Mingxian had no art education or professional experiences in architecture. He studied literature in undergrad and worked in Beijing as a journal editor. As the curator of the 1989 Modern Art exhibition, Wang Mingxian has a great interest in political criticism. His preferences for criticality resistance, and dissidence was further reflected in the architects that he selected as part of the experimental architecture movement. So these architects, you might know some of their names. This is Yongho Chang, Wang Shu, Liu Jiakun, and Dong Yugan. The architects grouped by Wang Mingxian at the time were the emerging independent architects that explored the alternative as scattered individuals, and thus emerged as a resistance to the dominating production model in China. Most of them were barely practicing due to the little possibility of getting commissions outside the state-regulated system. So they communicated their architectural ideals through conceptual designs and texts, and very few of them were lucky enough to be assigned with small projects like artist studios, display rooms, or bookshelves through personal connections. This group of architects were referred to as experimental architects within the architectural community. However, at the time, it was a barely noticeable sparkle among the overall totalitarian system and the vast urbanization and modernization processes in China. In 1999, during the Beijing UIA conference, Wang Mingxian curated an exclusive exhibition for the experimental architects to display the possible future of Chinese architecture against a totalitarian reality. So as you can see in the poster on the right, on the left, there is the curator's name, and the exhibiting architects were like 8 architects. And the 2 images on the right are the projects that were like conceptual or not exactly built at the time. So this domestic debut of independent architects was unfortunately shut down right before it was opened by the authority. Nevertheless, a German architect and curator, Edward Kugel, who was visiting Beijing at the time, accidentally went into the half-closed exhibition hall and observed the works on display. He was astonished by the conceptual novelty of these projects and immediately realized that there was a hint of criticality and resistance even in the seemingly totalitarian system in China. After Kugel went back to Germany, he planned for an exhibition to display the alternative independent practices in China, which were never exposed to the Western world before then. He made the initial connection through a German master's student, Tanja Reith, who was an exchange student in China in 1998, and new architect Liu Jiakun. He also contacted Yongho Chang, who was the only Chinese architect at the time who had some international connections and impact. So step by step through these personal connections, Kugel was able to build a list of emerging experimental architects. It is worth noting that his initial selection was built upon the 99 exhibition on experimental architecture. And he also got the list from Liu Jiakun and Yongho Chang, who are both core members of the movement. Therefore, the architects that Kugel reached out for all belong to more or less the same circle, or so to speak, the small circle that was put together initially by Wang Mingxian. Then in year 2000, Kugel, Reith, and the other curator, Wolf Mayer, went on a trip to China to collect materials and made their selection. And after visiting Beijing, Shanghai, Chengdu, Hangzhou, and Nanjing, they were able to communicate with these architects in person. And in the end, 4 architectural studios, 1 artist, and a group of 4 university-based architects were put on display. The exhibition was held in an extremely small gallery, and the projects were exhibited in very conventional ways, namely models, texts, and photos. But it was a very ambitious one, and it did cause international and domestic sensation soon after. This exhibition, from my personal perspective, was very notable in a number of ways. So first of all, the curators aimed to challenge the Western stereotypes on China as the biggest construction site in Asia, and they tried to inaugurate new debates, although they were aware of the fact that the exhibited works only comprised a small proportion in China's overall development. As Kugel notes, the organizers of the exhibition abandoned the existing Chinese term experimental architects in order to, quote, free it from the experimental situation and to cause bigger impact, end quote. Also, the title, Young Architecture of China, is itself a very powerful statement that recognizes these architects as the future hope of China. The press release defines the exhibited works as, quote, the first promising hints for the development of an independent architectural language, end quote. And the curator powerfully asserts that, quote, in terms of architectural aesthetics and conception, the young Chinese designers have arrived at the heart of contemporary debates in architectural culture. These are all very powerful assertions at the time. Furthermore, the curators only selected built works and intentionally left out the conceptual designs that comprised a large part of the 90s experimental architecture movement. This means that although both exhibitions focused on the same group of architects, Kugel's curatorial intention deviates a lot from Wang Mingxian's idea. So for Wang Mingxian, the experimental architecture was a vehicle for reflections over the mainstream ideology and the existing production model. Whether the projects were built or not was irrelevant, and functionality, budget, or social engagement was very little considered. The German exhibition strictly requested all displayed projects to be built projects. Even those, most of the independent architects were still at a very early stage of their professional career and barely had more than 1 or 2 built projects in their portfolios. So take this project by Wang Shu as an example. So this was a page from the catalog of the exhibition. If you're familiar with Wang Shu's works, you could see that this project is very different from the works that he was famous for in his later career. The most obvious thing is that it does not leave room for him to explore his understanding of material. But this was his only built project at the time, and so it was selected to be exhibited in this exhibition. So I think this was because that the curators had to make sure all designs were actually carried out in order to make a convincing argument on the possibility of change in China. However, many of the conceptual architects and artists like Zhao Bing and Li Juchuan, they were unfortunately left out, and the spirit they carried also faded gradually. Also, in order for the German audience to better understand the exhibition, works that reflect modernist influences and local cultural features are especially favored by the curators. Apparently, the small-scale modernist buildings are easily relatable for the German audience, and the indigenous materials or construction methods, on the other hand, visually conveys the quote-unquote Chineseness. Zhang Lei's student dormitory, for instance, is a very typical case in this regard. So on the opening ceremony, Hans Stiemann, the head of Berlin planning authorities, commented on Zhang's project, which reminds him of the new Prussian style he favored for Berlin, relating the facade of the dormitory to German modernism very directly. And soon after the exhibition, local newspapers quickly selected the facade image of Taoyuan dormitory as their frontal illustration for the report of the exhibition. So the visibly identifiable influence from ETH makes Zhang's project easily relatable for the German architects and editors. On the other hand, some comments also noted the use of wood shutters, where they see a connection to China's traditional boat building techniques. So the combination of modernist formal order and local building conventions is what defines both contemporary and Chinese in a foreign context. Moreover, the curators selected independent practices against the dominating production model in China. Their value came from the spirit of resistance that they carried. It is worth noting that the Germans are particularly against the socialist system after the Cold War. The Soviet production model in East Germany was dismissed as anti-democratic, and in this context, the independent architects from China represented a new hope that might invade the socialist system and maybe even take over in the future. Therefore, although their practices were experimental and barely matured at the time, the Germans still valued their resistant attitude in high regard. So art historian Mary Leduc in her book talked about the value of dissidence in the popularization of contemporary Chinese art in the Western market. In terms of architecture, things are more or less similar. We should notice that most architects only had 1 or 2 built projects at the time, and it would be really hard for European architects or American architects with similar professional experiences to get such attention. Therefore, we may say that a huge part of the reason why these architects were exhibited was not due to the quality of their projects, but due to the spirit of resistance that they embodied. Additionally, Ai Weiwei's participation in the exhibition also blurred the boundary between artist and architect. The curator, Kugel, mentioned that Ai Weiwei did not want to be part of the exhibition at first, because he insisted that he is an artist and not an architect. But Kugel said that I don't care whether you are architect or artist, and I only care about the quality of your works. So there he came. And interestingly, this exhibition enabled Ai Weiwei to become part of the architectural community. After the exhibition, he became known to people as an artist and an architect. And he was invited to do lectures in architecture schools. And he curated exhibitions in China that explored the intersection between art and architecture. And he was assigned as the chief architect for the big project, the Bird Nest, for Beijing Olympics. This phenomenon indicates that the tendency of evaluating architecture through the lens of visual captivity was rising at the time in China. As you can see from this page here, which is also a page from the catalog of TUMU, the projects that were on display had a very simple but powerful form, but we can hardly imagine its function. So the aesthetic values really overweighs the practical aspects in architectural production. And lastly, the emerging education program was also addressed in the exhibition. 4 architects from Nanjing University were presented in the exhibition as a group. They were not from one studio, but together represented the architectural program at Nanjing University. An architect group backed by their home institution, like this was something that was unseen in the European countries, and it quickly seized the attention of the curator, the German art critics, and other scholars. The curator discussed new possibilities that were brought about by this emerging architectural program, and soon after TUMU, other curators and editors also further explored this unique model of architectural production. Linda Vlassenrood, a Dutch curator, for instance, discussed how universities in China supported independent architects in a number of ways. They provided teaching positions, platforms of avant-garde debates, and assigned on-campus projects for architects to test their experimental ideas. Therefore, universities provided room for alternative ideas and practices to breathe and to crack the utilitarian production system step by step. So in the above mentioned aspects, we can say that TUMU remarkably made a series of powerful points in spite of the small scale of the exhibition. So although TUMU was a very small exhibition, it represented an unprecedented international recognition for the Chinese architects at the time. This is due partly to the fact that architecture as a profession and discipline was imported from the West in the beginning, and therefore Chinese architects learned European-centered architectural history as the only prestigious version of world architecture. And German modernism in particular was highly admired by most. For instance, in this image, you can see Liu Jiakun's project here has a very obvious reference to modern architecture, and it was critically questioned by the German journalists at the time. Well, nevertheless, a recognition from a German architectural gallery meant a great deal for the whole architectural community back then. And one scholar even noted that being exhibited in Germany in 2001 was like, quote, entering the book of architectural history, end quote. Although the mainstream academic journals did not report this exhibition, relevant discussions appeared in all kinds of private design magazines and an online platform. The heated debates revolving around these reports gradually caught the attention of the editors and scholars in the mainstream system as well. They have realized that changes are happening and the younger generation is paying increasing attention to the alternative media platforms and barely read the mainstream academic journals. And consequently, the mainstream started to change as well. So in 2002, the director and the chief editor of the journal Time and Architecture attended the TUMU Back Home exhibition. As you can see in the photo on the left, the lady on the right is the director of the Tongji University Press, and the chief editor of Time and Architecture journal is standing right next to her. So this journal, Time and Architecture, started reporting the activities of independent architects. On the cover, you can see on the right, they are starting to feature experimental practices on their cover. And so this recognition from the mainstream academic journals also made independent architects' work more visible. And furthermore, the architects' professional careers was changed as well. Some of TUMU participants reoriented their design philosophy to better align with the Western criteria. Zhang Lei, for instance, focused more on small-scale projects with an awareness for the use of materials after his wood shutters were complemented by the Germans. As his colleague Zhu Jingxiang notes, that the exhibition was a crucial turning point in Zhang Lei's career as a practitioner. Formerly, his work vacillated between high-quality small-scale cultural products and large-scale state-commissioned buildings. But after the exhibition, he had a clearer idea of what he wants to pursue with his life and focused on quality design up to now. Also, as you see in the two images here, Zhang Lei's later works also applied the similar wood shutters, and this even became his signature element for some time. I once saw an article in a fashion magazine that he was referred to as the wood shutter Zhang, which is quite hilarious. The younger architects who were practicing in the state-owned design institutes was also encouraged by the success story of TUMU. Liu Yichun, Zhuangshen, and Chen Yifeng exemplify the young architects who resigned from the state planned system and started their own studio. Liu Yichun, in particular, visited the TUMU exhibition in Berlin in person and wrote a review on it, admiring the design quality of Ai Weiwei's work. And interestingly, after the young architects left the design institutes, these design institutes also started to reform to cope with the emerging situation. They started to prevent talented architects from leaving by establishing independent studios for them inside the system, where they could author their designs as creative individuals and still use the resources of the bigger system. And dealing with the competitive emerging architectural studios, this was an attempt to integrate the public and private sectors in China's socialist market economy. Also, many Chinese architects who were practicing overseas started to come back to China. The news of TUMU was quite widespread, and many took it as a sign that independent studios could survive and maybe even replace the design institutes one day. Architects including Zhu Pei, Xu Tiantian, Zhang Ke, Hua Li, Dong Gong mostly returned and to open their studios around year 2001 to 2004. These architects were already familiar with ways of publicity, the real estate market, and the use of cultural capital in architecture. So step by step, they were reframed as the new creative class in China. Soon enough, the independent architects were recognized by the authority as well. Although TUMU was unapproved by China's Academy of Architecture before its opening, the independent architects started to represent China officially just 2 years later. In the 2003 exhibition on contemporary Chinese art and architecture at Center Pompidou, Most of the exhibitors from TUMU were invited for the architecture section. Unlike TUMU, which was an exhibition based on private connection, the 2003 exhibition was a national level exchange project. This exhibition signaled the legitimization of independent Chinese architects at home. And then in 2005, the Chinese pavilion at the Venice Biennale was opened for the first time. And Wang Shu was the only architect who represented China with his work. For a country that puts such emphasis on collectiveness and mass modernization, it was shocking that Wang Shu was appointed to represent China as an individual. This was also a turning point in his career, since he met many European curators and scholars during the exhibition and somehow made a name for himself in Europe. So we can see that amazingly such radical change in the system happened in only 2 or 3 years. TUMU's overseas impact was quite notable as well. Many Western curators and scholars started to notice the emerging practices from China. And soon enough, from year 2003 to 2008, 8 exhibitions focusing on independent Chinese architects happened in France, Netherlands, Italy, Germany, and the United States. Despite the shifting institution scale, financial source, and theme, all these exhibitions featured the same group of architects who are generally underlined by their overseas architectural education experiences, affiliations to universities in major Chinese cities, small to medium scale privately or university commissioned projects, and a critical attitude towards the rapid, large-scale urbanization process promoted by the design institutes. The criteria for selecting representatives of the so-called contemporary Chinese architecture were thus gradually consolidated through this process. So now, if we look at the MoMA exhibition again, we may notice a few things that marked its curatorial intentions. As we can see from the curatorial texts on the right, there are several keywords that we can extract from this text, like a new generation of independent Chinese architects, commitment to social and environmental sustainability, reinterpretation of ancient construction techniques, economic rejuvenization of rural villages, small-scale interventions, resource-conscious and socially oriented architectural practices. So there are several features that are worth noting. First of all, the curatorial narrative is centered on sustainability. It celebrates the rural development, the periphery, and is against the mass modernization and urbanization processes in China. Therefore, the curatorial narrative is consistent with the theme of TUMU, the state-planned production system that trembles on the legacies of ancient villages, ignores the environmental damage, and pursues speedy modernization, has long been criticized by the Western observers. Judging from my interviews with the European curators, it was clear that many of them were particularly interested in Liu Jiakun's rebirth bricks and Wang Shu's reused tiles. Also, when Wang Shu was awarded the Pritzker Prize in 2012, the committee also highlighted his use of recycled materials as an approach against the vast demolition in China. Therefore, we may say that sustainability and recycling in this context is politicized. It is not just about environmental and resource issues, but also implies a resistance towards the mainstream. Furthermore, the curator intentionally picked architects that were neither directly nor partly related to the design institutes. So they're all 100% independent architects. By emphasizing their alternative position outside the system, the curator is again highlighting the value of dissidence, which was central to TUMU. In 2001, Kugel also described this group of architects as positions far from the crowd, addressing their marginality. And interestingly, after 20 years, these architects are still referred to as emerging practitioners. So personally, I'm not exactly sure whether this description is still valid now, since a lot of them have well developed into some sort of new orthodox in China. They are assigned important cultural projects and cooperate with governments and hold prestigious positions in universities at home and abroad. Also, they represent China on world platform. Moreover, the exhibition itself is designed with an obvious emphasis on materiality. Let's take a close look at the models on display. The bronze model from Atelier des Haus and the porcelain model from Studio Zhupei are so abstracted from the original building that they can no longer be viewed as mere scaled representations of architecture. They're objects on their own and must be appreciated as such. On the website of this exhibition, there is a video of the curator addressing his admiration for Zhupei's porcelain model, which is described as a stunning artifact on its own. So the function of these models deviates from representing the architecture, but somehow replaces them and inclines towards artworks. Sorry, sir, someone that should be. Okay, sorry. So I personally find it hard to relate the bronze model, porcelain model, and the tile pieces back to the building itself. And the display of such objects somehow erases the building rather than represents it. And lastly, I think the exhibition presents a romanticized version of the rural and suburban conditions in China. And it is not based on a comprehensive understanding of the social realities in China's countryside. Donggong's Yangshuo mountain retreat, which made the cover of this exhibition, is a typical project that romanticizes the countryside as a spiritual harbor for nostalgia. Indeed, it is a well-designed and aesthetically stunning project, but it is way above the average consumption level of Chinese people, and is only meant for the upper class to enjoy themselves in a rural setting. The romanticized image it creates is unrelated to the local lives of ordinary people, and it has little, if not anything, to do with the real rural revival. The image and story-based reality that is displayed in exhibitions is quite at odds with the social realities in China. So comparing the MoMA exhibition to TUMU, we can at least come to some conclusions. First of all, we should acknowledge the fact that independent architects in China have progressed tremendously in terms of international recognition, from a small gallery in Berlin to one of the most prestigious museums in the world. Being invited to MoMA is itself a great success for every architect, and also for the group of contemporary Chinese architects in general. Yet we should also note that Westerners are still framing Chinese contemporary practices that combine modernist order and local building conventions. The other theme, so there are some recurring themes that is always talked about in these exhibitions. And one is the visually identifiable cultural identities. And the other theme is the social and environmental commitment against the mainstream. Other emerging phenomena in the urban and architectural scene in China are seldom noticed, still less explored. Also, compared to the contemporary Chinese architects, compared to the contemporary Chinese artists, architects from China are still heavily bonded by the nation-centered narrative. We can see that although these architects are very different in terms of education background, professional experiences, and design approaches, they're always grouped together for being Chinese. The notion of contemporary Chinese architecture itself indicates the cultural homogeneity and the erasure of local specificities within the border of China. It is understandable that the generalization of these practices under the umbrella of nationality was a very convenient way to quickly introduce them to the Western audience in the early 2000s, when people had little idea of what's happening in China. But I personally think it's a shame to see that the discourse has hardly developed after 20 years. And lastly, exhibition as a form of knowledge production is probably incapable of digging further on the topic of contemporary Chinese architecture. The time of the quote unquote discovering China has passed. In the early 2000s, exhibition was a great way to discuss the emerging practices in China, since it's publicly oriented, it's highly sociable and eventful. Exhibition provides high volumes of information through spatialized arrangement of high amounts of text, images, and physical models. And it also integrates resources and stimulate cross-cultural encounters. And therefore, exhibitions are very suitable for subjects that are understudied and inconclusive. In 2001, discussing contemporary Chinese architecture through an exhibition was both meaningful and effective. But whether a general introduction on the same architect group still holds value today is quite debatable. And maybe it's time for scholars and curators to go beyond the existing frameworks and dive deeper into more detailed aspects of Chinese architects. So that's basically everything in this lecture. I've got to say it's a lot to think about. And I hope you all have a more comprehensive understanding of the MoMA exhibition after this lecture. I'm more than happy to further discuss any thoughts or ideas you might have, whether regarding these two exhibitions or the development of contemporary Chinese architecture in general. Also, I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Dijia, for your lecture. It was really great. And it's really nice to host you as our first guest lecture for the Asian Club design dialogue. And if anyone has questions, please feel free to send them in the chat or feel free to speak out. I think while people are still gathering questions, I have a couple of questions that I want to ask personally, because I think a lot of your lecture informations brought me a lot of perspectives that I never thought of before. I think because I gained my architecture education knowledge here in the US, in the Western world, and I had no idea about the AIDAS exhibition back in 2000 about the TUMU. And I know they have an ongoing exhibition at AIDAS in Berlin about this Chinese architect, Xu Tiantian, DNA architect, DNA design. Their ongoing exhibition is exhibiting a similar sort of context. They're doing a MoMA, the reuse, renew, recycle. So they're showcasing a conversion of 9 Chinese abandoned quarries into new uses. It's almost like a scenic park. They turned a abandoned mine into a scenic park. I think a lot of the information in your lecture, you talked about this conflicts between local and global perspectives on architecture, because you mentioned that a lot of these architects being featured either in TUMU or MoMA exhibition ongoing, all of them actually gain their architectural education background in the Western world in a way that they're being recognized by the Western Architecture Association because they had been exposed to a lot of these architectural education or history, and they have these cultural capitals, so they're able to do that. But in reality, there's this huge gap between the Chinese general public, such as how the actual lives of people in the village in China, or the general public, where a lot of the plannings and building decisions are being made by the authority, like by a couple important figures in China society. I think if you could address some the relationship between the independent architects from China who had gained their architecture knowledges from the Western world, and would you be able to address something? Are they representing the sort of images of Chinese cultural architecture, or they're rather setting up a sort of like a guideline for the general public to follow? Or is it possible for them to actually blur these kind of marginal gaps between the public conception and the Western recognition?
Thank you for this question. I think it's an interesting way to think about their practices. I personally think that identity itself is something that is co-constructed by the self and by the other. Like you see yourself through others. So I think their representation of Chinese culture, Chinese elements, is something that the conception is gradually formed by their interaction with the local people and also with the outside world. It's something that they learn from their cultural environment, and also they go out to the world and exchange their ideas and see what other people think of them. So I think it's hard to say whether what they're doing is, setting up an image for the Western world or for the public in China.
Right.
I would say that there are different ways of understanding identity, and China is a huge place. Like what local means and what Chinese means for Chinese people and for like people in one province or another province or for the Western people is quite different. So I would say that it's a process, and that people it's a co-constructive thing that is forming in the process, I would say.
Thank you. Is there any other questions from the audience?
I have not really a question, but I just thought I might comment on this very rich discussion. I'm an art historian and look at art, sociology of art as opposed to architecture. So my knowledge of architecture is not that great. But what I find interesting in Dijia's work is the sort of parallels between what was happening in the way that Chinese architecture was recognized in the West in comparison to Chinese contemporary art. And so I find that kind of fascinating because I'm finding some of the similar things there. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions that come out of this. For example, even in the art world today, there's more of an emphasis on enveloping and bringing in other disciplines into the art world. So the very fact that there's a Chinese architecture exhibition being held at MoMA says a lot right there, in that the art world itself, and when I say art world, I'm talking about all the institutions that support making of art, are wanting to bring in architecture as art. This is not unusual in that there's all sorts of different disciplines now being pulled into the art world, and this is just one of them. So that's kind of interesting. But I start looking at this and think, well, what is it of value? What is it that is being valued here? And Dijia has pointed out just a number of these things, and they're very much the same as in the contemporary art world. For example, the prestige of naming, of somebody being singular as opposed to working in a group. And this is interesting in the architecture context, because architecture is so much of a collaborative effort in the long run. It's not just one person's design ideas, but they have to be executed by many people. But there's an emphasis on bringing out what Natalie Hynek has called singularity, this idea that the artist is this unique individual who produces this one unique idea. And they're celebrated for that in the West. And this has been really sort of a value that came out of the modern avant-garde particularly, although we could find evidence of it prior in the Renaissance. For example, Michelangelo was admired for his work at his time as a singular individual, for example. So really sort of rooted, goes right back to the Renaissance and onward, so that the artisan or the artist is not just a maker of things, but is somebody special, has this special knowledge. And then there's the sort of that idea of personal creativity, that only this idea could come from that one individual. So again, the singularity. But also one of the sort of theories that I mentioned in my book that Dijia referenced is this idea of dissidence, that art needs to be challenging convention in some way. And I can see that happening in the architecture as well, that she's talking about, is that the architects are being admired for challenging convention in some sense. Now, initially that was in materials and form and that kind of thing. But what you're talking about now, perhaps in this MoMA exhibit, which I haven't seen and will not be able to see, is that there's sort of new values in the art world now, challenging environmental issues, challenging neoliberalism and capitalism, for example, and those kinds of things. Those are popular themes within contemporary art as well. So it sounds like these architects are being championed for also presenting a sort of dissident message about that, but also in the context of China, which again adds a whole other dimension to these artists. And I think Dijia picks up on that very well in terms of mentioning how they're always Chinese architects. I don't know, maybe Dijia knows how many architects are recognized out in the international world who aren't designated as Chinese. I mean, who come from China, but are just recognized for their architecture as opposed to their national or ethnic background. So it's always the same thing happens in contemporary art. The artists are constantly referred to as Chinese, 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 instead of just, they're great contemporary artists. So there's obviously a value in the West for recognizing these things. Then I think her paper also points out, turns around, what's the value in China for these? So since 2001, China's actually promoted these independent architects against their larger system of sort of corporate architects. And so what's the value to them? And the same thing happened with art. The exhibition she references in 2001, Alors Chine in Paris, was also one of the first examples, or one of the first, it was 2003, sorry, was the first example of Chinese contemporary art being sponsored by the Chinese government. But they were very careful on who they selected. So that's another point. And here's just one last point I wanted to make, which is kind of interesting, is that in my travels in China and going to art schools and universities, I noticed that design and architecture was promoted a lot. There was a lot more emphasis on those. The students seemed to me to be much freer to be creative and experimental. So it's a good point, Dijia. But in the artworks, I found that their artworks was much more backwards through those years. And I'm talking from about 2001 through 2011, and was not as sort of up to date as Western art in terms of their sort of dissident quality and the themes that they were dealing with. And there, I had some suspicion that perhaps the government supported architecture and design more because it's much harder to be overtly political in it. Mm-hmm. Like it has to be much more formal because you can't, it's got less, where painting, you can show an image and you can be a Mao, for example, and you can be quite contentious, but you know, how do you do that in architecture? So there's another sort of side to that, which might be an interesting trail to follow. Anyway, so more of a comment than anything there, Dijia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we still have time for me to make a few remarks on what Mary just said? Okay. So I think it's a great point that you mentioned singularity and how that's, you know, so taken for granted in the architecture world. Because I also talked to Edward Kugel last year about like why we never exhibit, why we never do real, you know, scholarly works and exhibit this researches on design institutes, because that's a model that is actually, you know, dominating China, and it's a very unique thing that it's not really seen in the Western world. There are a lot of interesting phenomena that are related to the model of, you know, design institutes, but we never really explore it. And he told me that he was very interested in that, but no gallery is going to show it because that's just too far away from how Europeans understand architecture and architectural production. So I think what we take for granted as what an architect is, that singularity, that individual creativeness, is also what really shapes the architectural scene in China today, and why these architects are, you know, framed as representatives of contemporary Chinese architecture. Another thing that you just mentioned is that architecture is safer than art in China, which I think is a great point, because like, indeed, we all know it's safer. And it just reminds me of a very interesting thing that in 2001 or 02, there was this art exhibition in Shanghai that was actually organized and participated by mostly by artists, but they call it a urban and architecture exhibition. So they can go through the, you know, to the authorities, and they can be approved. But it's actually a very important event that marked the surfacing of contemporary Chinese artists, in China, because they found this middle ground to show their works, but also compromise with the government in a certain way. So yeah, it just reminds me of that very interesting thing. I also think it's a very interesting thread to follow.
Thank you, Dijia, for that remark, because I think something that perhaps the individual architects struggle in China a lot is how do they work around this authority? Like the way you mentioned, the way that the artists, they came up with the way to kind of put a mask over what they're actually doing and then actually went through it and made it happen. I think that's amazing. Thank you.
I think we still have time, right? Because I want to actually jump into less about a question, but opening up a discussion, because I think you mentioned something in your presentation saying when you show the model, the model exhibited in the art gallery, in the gallery space, right? The Brazilian kind of model. It's no longer a scaled representation of the architecture or the building itself. And you also mentioned this kind of idea that, you just said, no gallery wants to exhibit a work did by a, design institute. And you kind of, saying, there's it's a unique phenomena in China that these, design institutes, design institution. But I think there's, different models in the US as well, these kind of big corporate kind of, HDR, KPF, these are just, huge corporate, in a way that design stuff and they're just bread and butter, every day, buildings, and they're just built. But the question here is that, not really a question, but, it's this kind of a theme I saw here is this kind of relationship between art and architecture. And when does a building become an art piece that can be exhibited in an art gallery, or in the architectural process, maybe somebody's napkin sketch, become a art piece or can be exhibited. I think OMA and Ramco has those are sort of better in terms of doing that. Yeah, I mean, it's not a question, but I just wanted to hear your thought, or maybe, Marie, your thought on this idea between, when does a building become a art piece? Who decides that? And also, this kind of relationship between artists and art critics, in a way, art critics sort of decides, it's getting into the, conceptual art, that sort of realm a little bit. So yeah, I just want to sort of hear your thought about, this relationship here.
Dijia, is that a question for me or Dijia, or both?
Or both. I mean, just hear both of your thoughts, in terms of the relationships between the two.
Great. Well, I think you brought up Ai Weiwei, which is a good example, because I was sort of wondering when he was going to pop up here, because he's a good example of the merging architect versus artist. But I think and his work has been sort of extolled as artwork, almost like, at least in the art world, more than architecture. He was actually doing some architecture before he gained his sort of real prominence in the art world. You talked about him in 2001, and it wasn't almost till 2011 that when he got arrested, became a real dissident, that his work, his prestige, his symbolic value in the art world really boomed. And then, of course, there was the 2008 Bird's Nest building. So that probably brought him more sort of international recognition as an architect right there, just that he does architecture. Most people hadn't known that. So you have this sort of merging of identity. I think that, so an architect, the star architect, some Dijia up when it's not that functional. Some of these early 1990s architects designed things that weren't really that practical functionally, or weren't built very well, or that kind of thing. So you're always in a problem between form and function. The art world itself has the freedom for people to build things just for the purpose of just making something to give you a thought. It doesn't have to be all that functional. That. And then I think display is another issue, because you can't pull the building in there. All you do is buy pictures and models. So and nice sculpture. Yes, they admired it for its sculptural form, which if you looked at they actually built the building, you could never admire it in the same way, because the scale would be totally different than what you're seeing in the museum as well. So I think what we're seeing is kind of an integration across in terms of prestige and symbolic value, in terms of attached to the identity of the artist. Okay, so they're Chinese, they've done a unique individual thing, so they're admired for that. But the object itself is always going to be in conflict in the art world, just because of its scale and its functionality. Those things, two things don't quite. Art doesn't need a function other than to be art. So, I don't know if that answers your question or not, or helps.
Thank you, Mary, for your answer. My internet is not exactly working very well, so let me know if I just stuck there, because okay. I think it's very interesting that Mary talked about the symbolic value. I think when an architectural work refers to some sort of symbolic value, it can be viewed as artwork in a certain way. Because like the experimental architecture that I mentioned in the 1990s, I think a lot of them are considered like they're designed as just proposals or installations. They're not meant to be built. I remember there was this one work designed by Dong Yugan, which is called Sun and Monument. It's a museum on Cultural Revolution, which obviously is never going to be built, but it's just a proposal that it's meant to make some point of political criticism. So I think these are the architecture that we can understand as artworks. But in a way, should they be understood as architecture? That's another question. So if they are just conceptual projects and they're never built, I think it's doubtful whether they're architecture at all. So yeah, I think that's my view in this question.
Sort of following up on that, since we still have some time, I just wonder if this idea of singularity, or as you said, use the term singularity, or what I said, sort of pin the authorship down to somebody, is this idea sort of contributing to Mary, you mentioned star architect, and how that also related to the toxic kind of culture in architectural firms, sort of celebrating, this kind of one individual, whereas there are actually many other, sort of contributing to one project. Makes me wonder if we should just break away from art at all, as architect, just no longer do art, because, art has this tradition of sort of pinning down the authorship to one people. But, as architects, in a sort of firm, especially these days, considering all this kind of, drama in these kind of architectural firms, not sure if you know that, that incident in Sci-Arc Institute a couple of days ago, one architectural student asks, how do you sort of respond to this kind of idea of overworking in architectural firms and sort of exploiting its employee, for the fame of, just one person, and yeah, it just makes me wonder, is that, is this tradition in architecture, is that something we should just break away from, really just start to recognizing the kind of the collective authorship of the things we built around, and put more names on. If we want to sort of put stuff in the gallery, just put more names on it instead of one.
Makes me laugh because it's actually happening in the art world too. You have more and more artist collectives working together and using and presenting themselves as a group. We have singular artists who worked for years on their own now, recognizing, particularly male artists, recognizing the work of their partners and their wives in their production, right? I don't think you're ever going to get rid of the symbolic value of prestige. It's very valuable in art, at least in Western culture, and I think almost probably a lot of cultures, we give it a lot of value. So whether it's science, where a group comes up with this vaccine, who gets the credit? Who gets the Nobel Prize? The one or two people, but not everybody. All the lab workers that worked for ages, or the people that were tested and so on, aren't named, right? I think all of, not just the arts, just everywhere we value as a social, just it's a social value, it's common in our society that we value people that do something unique and creative. And the art world plays that up as the single individual who creates something totally new, and plays with that value. And in different disciplines, that value is more valuable than other places, but certainly in architecture, it's happened. And like you say, I think it does create tensions, especially when something's created by a group. So how do you resolve that? I'm not sure. Maybe like the movies, you could have long credits after every you could have a billboard on the building that gives, lists every last person down to the brickmaker who made something, right?
I think that's what we should do, simply, at least, for me, I actually teach in the landscape, just so I'm sort of working in the landscape field of landscape architecture, where, recently, the theory is more about, collective agency, or this kind of sort of understanding agency as distributed among a heterogeneous kind of actors, whether it's human or non-human. So in a way, we are kind of forcing our students to understand that a thing is not, you cannot really pin down a authorship to one thing, but you always have to sort of recognize the collective, even sort of, you cannot even trace the collective. And the question or the challenge is that, how do we started to take on that lens and started to recognize, when it's the authorship is only something you just pin down to something. It's never existed, sort of pre-existed. That's actually, that's just my opinion on these issues.
Mm-hmm. But then you have to be careful. Do you go back to something that was, the sort of way architecture was done in China before, as Dijia pointed out, the big workshop where everybody works, they're all anonymous. You produce one thing. Who directs it though? Who decides what's going to be made?
Right. Yeah.
And,
in the decision-making
and,
process.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. And certainly architecture is a discipline that's interesting because it has to follow some conformity, because you don't want buildings to fall down. You want them to meet certain codes.
Right.
So there
is that's actually another, when people discuss agency, when it's actually, people say it's actually more easier just to trace responsibility in a way, because the reason to pin down an author is you have to sue someone when the building is falling down.
Right. And in the contemporary art world, you don't have those restraints in many ways, other than you don't really want the artwork collapsing in the art gallery and injuring the viewer or something, right? But you don't have to really, you can manipulate materials in so many different ways. You're not constrained by civic codes, building codes, that kind of thing. So, maybe architecture is not, it plays with sort of bleeding into the contemporary art world, but could never really be totally there for that very reason. I don't know. So,
Do we have more questions in the audience? Because it's just us talking. We had fun, but
Yeah, there hasn't been any question in the chat either. Last call.
I mean, if not, it's I just say, thank you so much for joining us, Dijia, and also Marie. Thanks for the, discussion in so, and also thank you for Menfei and Lanhua and the club members who organized this events, and this is great. And I hope, we can have more of this kind of similar events, every year. And thank you again, Dijia, for joining us. And thank you again, the audience who just joined and some left already. But thank you so much. And
Thank you all for inviting me.
Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you, Dijia. It's great to have you. And thank you, Marie.
Thanks, Dijia. Good talk.
Have a
Yep.
good one.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you. Bye. I'll follow up with you, Dijia. Bye.
Bye.
Yep.
Thank you. Very interesting lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.